For my first model, the concept was to create a dynamic, visually interesting piece which is reinforced by the variation in shape, size, and depth of space. The two contrasting triangles, coupled with the rhythmic arrangement of the rectangles, gives the model the dynamic feel that I was going for. My first model, which was created in Series 3, was not very developed and it had a very 2D feel to it. So from there, I expanded the idea, making the model more 3D and playing with the placement of the rectangles. Rhythm is an element that I wanted to be prevalent in this particular model, and the diagram depicts that. The arrows are added to help reinforce the movement of the rectangular shapes. While one triangle is solid, the other has a smaller triangle cut from it that creates contrast. Contrast is also depicted by the variation in the triangular and rectangular shape shown in the second diagram. For my second model, the concept was to create an elegant flowing piece modeled off of objects found in nature. I took inspiration from the plants in my room and included their rhythmic forms in my model to reinforce the concept. These diagrams depict the rhythm in the model achieved by scoring the Bristol board and curving lines which relate to the shape of the form itself. These diagrams show the contrast in the model with the smooth, sweeping lines of the paper versus the crumpled texture of the plastic bags. While the scored lines move in a rhythmic, orderly fashion, the plastic bags are situated in a seemingly random, almost chaotic way.
For my first model, I wanted to create a form that shows off movement and continuity with rhythmic features that dance through joined planes. And my main principles I wanted to emphasize are rhythm and balance. For my first iteration of this, as you can see, it wasn't very perpendicular. It seemed very messy in the foam core work. But the main idea was that you were supposed to look through the top and see this pattern of the cross-hatching in the negative space. And so when I analyzed it, I noticed the proportion between the different sizes of the planes and the pattern in the lattice work. But I wanted to emphasize it more as a 3D form as opposed to just something very blocky and static. And so I created an idea that had it cut through the different forms to emphasize movement and, you know, create more visual interest. And so I created this pattern off of this image. It didn't work at first, so I had to tweak it a little bit. But then I made this out of cardstock and then moved forward into making that into foam core. My first iteration of this still had a bit of problem with, you know, balance visually and no visual hierarchy between the framework and the negative space, and was still a bit messy in my foam core work, but that did get better as my next iteration, which, as you can see here, has more visual balance and has more hierarchy between the different aspects of it. And I feel like it is much more interesting. And even though I lost a bit of the pattern in it, it becomes more visually striking. For my second form, I wanted to create a form that emphasizes tension between two similar yet different masses at a single point of balance. And my main elements here are contrast and asymmetrical balance. I was working off of Keilan's second iteration. I wanted to emphasize more of the triangle spaces because I thought that those were the most interesting about how they have, you know, different masses but are very similar. So I wanted to move forward with that. My first iteration of this had a little bit of problems in that the tension between the two forms, it seems a little too exact in that the bottom form is as tall as the top form, but it isn't as wide. So it felt like they were, you know, fighting a little bit. But the next one has more tension because the smaller one is smaller, but it is fuller. So it also fights with the top form in that way. And as you can see, the midpoint isn't exactly in the middle, so that creates more interest of the eye. And these are the final pictures of that same last form.
So I'd like to start by saying that I am very much of a narrative person, and I like to include this in my work. I love nature, specifically animals, and I wanted to include that love in some of the models for this final series. The concept behind this first model was to be able to convey the sleekness and playfulness as well as the powerfulness of the sea lion while using as little detail as possible. I really was focusing on achieving this by expression of the tail, the overall curved form of the model, and the significance of the ball balancing on the nose. So these are some previous iterations of the final model. It began with it being incredibly economic and being nothing more than a simple, elegant form, the swooping line. And as I continued, the model became less economic to include other principles, the image on the far right capturing emphasis and gradient as well as economy. These are some different views from different angles, so just a simple but elegant form. Finally, these are the two principles I really wanted to focus on: economy on the left and balance on the right. The use of economy was used to isolate the sleekness of the form because it shares this commonality of a swooping line. They are pretty flexible animals, and balance was used to help focus on power and playfulness between the ball balancing on the nose and the expressive tail flippers, as well as the base it is balancing on. There's this nice distribution of visual weight that is showing off the expressive parts of the sculpture. So for this model, I was really inspired by the shapes and forms of sailboats. I live at a lake, so they're a pretty common sight to see. I wanted to capture the elegance of thin lines combined with solid forms, specifically this fin-like structure. I also wanted to capture the movement that is reminiscent of a sailboat blown across the water. That inspiration motivated the position in which the three forms are placed, each one trailing the other. The bigger the sail, the farther the distance. The strings that flow in and out of the structures added this sort of chaos that I really liked and also contributed to the rhythm of the piece. This was the first iteration of the final model. Although it seemed a little unfinished, I figured if I added more string and alleviated some weight from that solid base, I could achieve a greater sense of elegance, like the structures are being blown into space. And then these are some different views of the piece. Each one sort of has this new way of pleasing the eye, yet they're all connected through the use of the continuing string. I also noticed that the string provided these really cool shadows in the negative space that added the rhythmic element of the composition as well as the overall visual experience. Finally, the two principles I was focusing on were proportion and rhythm, each contributing to the movement of the piece. Proportion was used by aligning the three objects. It increases by a half every time, so 3, 6, 12. This gave the impression of the sailboats trailing one another, and then rhythm was seen through the use of the string both from afar and up close. The continuation of the string is a sense of movement all by itself, yet provides an even greater sense of movement when combined with the proportional fins. It also contributes to the essence of a sail and a mast. And that's our presentation.